Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. My name is Carl Stitchen, and I'm the Director of IALS. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to Law and Humanities in a Pandemic. This series of monthly remote workshops seeks to make sense of the wide-ranging relationship between law and the pandemic through the insights of the humanities, broadly understood as the set of cultural influences which are shaping the use of law and the responses to it. As part of the School of Advanced Study in the University of London, the Institute is committed to a spirit of interdisciplinary inquiry focused on the humanities as a means of better understanding the world we face. Today's workshop is entitled Movement, Security, and Lockdown, and features 3 papers. Our format is as follows. Each speaker will have up to 20 minutes to present their paper, and questions can be raised by our audience members in the Q&A function at any time. Following each speaker's presentation, I will attempt to moderate questions to that presenter and also to raise any general questions and comments at the end of the session. The workshops are scheduled for 90 minutes. Our first paper today is by Harrison Chitrawan and Sabrina Nadila and will be presented by Sabrina. Harrison is a researcher at the Law and Human Rights Research Agency under the Ministry of Law and Human Rights in the Republic of Indonesia. His research areas are in the field of human rights policy, prison studies, transitional justice, and Indonesia's penal system. Sabrina is a policy analyst at the Ministry of Law and Human Rights in the Republic of Indonesia. Her work focuses on issues of law, human rights, and institutionalism. She graduated in law from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Yogyakarta. Their paper is entitled Penal System and Biopolitics in the Time of COVID-19 Pandemic, an Indonesian Experience. Welcome, Sabrina, and over to you.
Thank you, Carl. Hello, everyone. Good evening from Jakarta, Indonesia. First of all, thank you so much, Carl, for arranging this series and the opportunity for us to participate in the series. It's been an honor for us to share our Indonesian experience to the rest of the world. So first, I will share my screen. Okay. Oops, sorry. Yep, my screen should be ready by now. Our paper is entitled The Penal System and Biopolitics in the Time of COVID-19 Pandemic, an Indonesian Experience. So before we begin the whole presentation, I would like to outline our presentation into five sections. The first section will be about the brief explanation on the conceptual framework of our paper, which is the Biopolitical Analysis of Law. It mainly outlines the relationship between discipline and governmentality and law. And the second section is building upon this framework. We will describe the knowledge construction of penal system in the midst of the current pandemic. And this is what we call as the penal imaginary. In the panel responses section, we will discuss the decarceration practice undertaken by Indonesian government as a response to COVID-19 pandemic. In biopolitical penal practice, we will explore this decarceration practice from the biopolitical lens within the backdrop of the imposition of social restriction policies. And lastly, we will turn back to our conceptual framework on how Indonesian experience showcased the nexus between the discipline, governmentality, and law through outlining a new penal imaginary that challenges the current idea of punishment and law. So moving on to the first section. In Biopolitical Analysis of Law, we attempt to connect the dots between law, discipline, and governmentality. So as pointed out by Tadros, law is managing the passage of individual from one system to another. And through law, all major aspects of our social life are subsumed under one logic of the norm. So everything is recodified by the norm of law. So in this sense, law, discipline, and governmentality have a mutually enforcing relationship. Discipline is interested in creating new subjects. So while governmentality is attempted to govern, to practice any rational effect to guide, or to influence the behavior of the subjects to manage the population. This broad nature of governmentality, so the government is not only exercised by the government as we traditionally understood. It involves all other actors such as the institutions and agencies, anyone that concerned exercising its authority over the conduct of human beings. So to reach the optimal level of the population, governmentality deploys law as its tactic. And the discipline and governmentality create a homogeneous social body. To put simply, it defines what kind of subject that is seen as normal. So the law enables this practice to recodify the person as subject of biopolitical practice commenced by its apparatus. So next, the penal imaginary in the pandemic. So throughout the pandemic, we have witnessed the reinvention of knowledge that bringing back the dignity and vulnerability of people within the carceral space from the perspective of others who are distinct from the traditional penal knowledge produced by the criminologists, the politicians, and jurists. The WHO guidelines and joint statement between the UNODC, WHO, UNAIDS, and OHCHR call for the appropriate public health measures in respect of this vulnerable prison population. So experts such as epidemiologists, virologists, and biologists have forecast the infection's trajectory. Prison is a vulnerable institution. Prison has its limits, and if it's ignored, it may lead to a catastrophe within the facilities. The knowledge of prison is therefore constructed by the experts, the medical doctors, and civil society organizations. And this knowledge implies that it is necessary to put people away from imprisonment. Okay, now the penal response in the pandemic for the first one is decarceration through the early release and parole. Informed by the international guidelines and several country practices, Ministry of Law and Human Rights alone decided to decarcerate prisoners through the early release and parole policy. The high rate of overcrowding in the country's prison, it is deemed as an effort to avoid catastrophe in prison. This early release and parole is applied to around 35,000 of inmates that have served the two-thirds of their sentence. However, it excluded several criminals, including drug-related crimes, corruption, terrorism, crimes against national security, gross violation of human rights, and transnational organized crimes. During a working hearing between the Parliament was Minister of Human Rights, and the policy was considered to be discriminatory due to the exclusionary clauses and lacking the sense of risk among vulnerable prisoners such as elderly and the juvenile. The public discourse is filled with public allegation that the government is planning to release the corruption and drug-related criminals. However, this resulted in a public qualification by the president, who clearly denied such an allegation. In several doorstep interviews, the minister reaffirmed the decision to exclude them from the correctional emergency measure. So rather than solely focusing on creating space, the government considered challenges that might occur due to the large additional number of people to the population. So as you can see on the screen, the number of overcrowding is decreased, and the number of home visit as a measure to reduce intake to the prison is increasing by 2020. So the second penal response of decarceration is the pecuniary sanctions. Okay. So by the end of March, we have the rapid escalation of cases. So it urged the authorities to declare the emergency situation nationwide, along with the large-scale social restriction policy. It is during the social restriction that the alternative sanctions is introduced, although the quarantine health law allows imprisonment for restriction violators. These pecuniary sanctions was first adopted by the Jakarta Authority and several local authorities such as West Java and Surabaya City applied the fines and community service as forms of punishment for health protocol violators. In Jakarta, for example, the face mask violation and mass gathering for over 5 persons is fined for around 5 to 13 pounds sterling. It's like 100,000 rupiah. With high number of violators, about 20,000 violators in the first phase of the restrictions from May to August. Jakarta increases the amount of fines from 13 to 53 pounds sterling and apply progressive fines mechanism for repeat violators. Moreover, it is deemed necessary to enhance the technique of discipline in the country. So the president, by issuing the Presidential Instructions number 6, 2020, authorizes the police, military, and local governments to optimize community caretaking in order to enhance discipline and health protocol law enforcement. It's last week or last 2 weeks, I guess, in late November, Jakarta finally enacted a bylaw that does not include imprisonment. Okay, so the biopolitical penal practice. The enactment of health protocols is during the social restrictions. We have the it's an abbreviation for washing hands and keeping the safe measures and stay away from the mass in large crowds. And regarding the large-scale social restriction, the authority did not impose a full-scale movement restriction or lockdown policy, as in Malaysia or as in Singapore. It only limited the activities within non-essential workplace, private vehicles, and public transportation. So no movement restrictions. However, it did strictly prohibit the large mass gatherings activities in public spheres. And over time, it decreased the restriction up to 50% of the capacity. So this restriction does not apply in a national scale. Rather, it is up to the governor or the mayor or the regions to propose the restrictions in their area. And this practice have reconstructed the notion of threat within the community. First, it aggravates the sense of vulnerability. Well, an additional 30,000 people to the population is perceived to trigger the struggle for space, for the safe space among the citizens. In the uncertain times, this restriction is related to the criminogenic situations, with streets getting with too many people, with less people doing activities in public space. It may triggers for the criminal to reoffend. And second, the restrictions have resulted in the economic crisis of unemployment. With not enough sense of security, citizens who heavily relied on informal economy is faced with the penalty of violating the health protocols at the cost of losing their stable income. And lastly, it's about the decentralization of disciplinary apparatus. On the one hand, the deployment of the military and police, it seems like state police behavior, but on the other hand, it fosters solid social solidarity, the value of gotong royong in Indonesia that is slowly eroded by modern rationalities. So, lastly, the shift in penal imaginaries. So the legal rhetoric of necessity throughout the conjunctural politics of penal response could be seen as the prosaic politics of emergency. In a historical timeline throughout several periods of emergency in Indonesia, it reflects the technique of penal practice in responding to the situation, which in turn shapes institutional knowledge within the criminal justice system. For instance, during the emergency of communist threat, the system responded through a mass incarceration. It also happened with the current high imprisonment on drug abusers. It also reflects a penal practice of war and drugs. So instead of seeing the emergency of decarceration during the COVID-19 pandemic as a single conjunctural moment, we tend to see this as an ongoing temporal process of managing a population. So as a biopolitical technology of power, these penal responses aim at the problematic of the population given the power knowledge structure. During the current time of the pandemic, the emergency of drug abuse, terrorism, and corruption insists that the penal system to necessarily exclude them from the early release and parole policy. As a result, the institutional knowledge on punishment to certain crimes prevails over the need to create space inside the prison and jail facilities, which was initially systemized by massive epidemiologist knowledge to foster the life of population. It is necessary to let these specific criminals die in carceral space. Furthermore, the economic form of social restriction, sanctions, is related to what Foucault sees as, I quote, the least costly and most effective form for obtaining punishment and the elimination of conducts deemed harmful to society. So clearly from the economic perspective, incarcerating the face mask violators or mask gathering violators would be unnecessarily expensive, not to mention the potential risk of a virus outbreak within the facilities due to the high numbers of violators. This rather showcase the vast bulk of justice that is made up of the routine and everyday array of health protocol infringement. In this case, imprisonment reserved only for those who could not pay fines or damage, or whose riskiness to others was too great to allow them to be free. The tactic of power used in the case of restriction sanctions emerged in a formula relied upon by Beccaria and Bentham, that the crime is defined as a breach of the law and fixed penalties are made available for such breaches. And these are graduated according to the seriousness of the crime. So instead of a deviant, irrational, and not entirely human person, the violators of this health protocol is conceived as a rational entrepreneur seeking to maximize profits while keeping costs down. The sanctions answer the concern over the additional insect to detention facilities, a problem that is to be addressed by the early release and parole policy. So in other words, the man who can be punished by law, the homo penalis, is rendered into homo economicus. Well, it is interesting to see the course of Indonesian penal system after this pandemic, because first, over the decades, we have seen how Indonesia is just moving on from one state of emergency to another state of emergency. Previously, the incarceration seems to be the answer to overcome the emergency, but with the current necessity to decarcerate, it might lead to penal moderation. And second, with the creation of the new subjects, the homo economicus, we are yet to know what kind of subject that is going to be recodified by the norm of law. However, we believe that this trajectory is contingent to the political and economic climate in Indonesia after the pandemic. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sabrina. That's a fascinating paper. amazing insights into the Indonesian experience. By way of questions, if I can begin, the idea of a prosaic penal emergency that is focused on decarceration is a fascinating one. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of history of this in Indonesia? And do you think this is purely a temporary, a kind of emergency situation, or do you think there is a potential longer term impact of this imaginary?
Well, that's what we are going to see. I mean, Indonesia is just moving on from the emergency to emergency at the after our independence. We are insecurating people as the tool for our revolution, and after that the same thing goes with the communism threat. We are incarcerating because they are seen as the enemy, and it's the emergency of the rise of communism. And in terrorism, after the 9/11, we are suddenly shifting our focus to the emergency on terrorism. So, but all of the emergency situation always leads to incarceration. So we are really curious on how this trajectory will lead to, because decarceration is the first phenomena we have found in Indonesian history, the decarceration.
Right. When you're I think very effectively talked about disciplinary apparatuses. That leads me to ask about obviously the most effective disciplinary apparatus ultimately is self-discipline of the subject. And by contrast, Foucault always said that with discipline comes resistance. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the extent to which the forms of discipline have led to the self-discipline of the normalization of discipline by the subject, and by contrast, forms of resistance that have been seen, if any.
Well, in terms of resistance, we haven't think to the extent of the resistance. So, but the discipline, well, I mean, it's quite ironic when we deploy a disciplinary apparatus while the numbers of the violators is increasing, and it's like we're trying to discipline, but on the other hand, seems like it doesn't work. So,
okay. And finally, I wonder if you can comment a little more about, you mentioned an idea, particular concept in Indonesia around social solidarity. And I wonder if you could just comment a bit more about how that's been utilized in the pandemic.
Okay, so we as opposed to the situation in Italy, for instance, there are neighborhood watchers, and for those who are violating the health protocols, sometimes they will be shamed by the neighborhood watchers, or they see the pandemic and the restriction as a restriction of their liberty. Well, in Indonesia, we are in a social restriction, but it triggers of our old value of gotong royong. So as opposed to the discourse on the internet that Indonesia is currently facing many problems on the disciplinary, on violators. But the pandemic has shown us that we have this community that will help you to get through of these troubling times. Like if in one neighborhood there's a family that is tested positive, we do not stigmatize them or anything. Well, at least in my in my neighborhood, it doesn't it didn't go that way. But we give them the food for their family, so we just put it outside of their homes. And apparently it's not a special case in Indonesia, as Indonesia is have communal culture, so we're experiencing it everywhere, especially in villages and rural areas. That's about the social solidarity.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we should move on to our next paper, but I wanted to thank you, Sabrina, and your co-author, Harrison, for your contribution today. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Carl.
Thank you. I think we now will move on to our next speaker, is Professor David Gurnham. David is Professor of Criminal Law and Interdisciplinary Legal Studies at the Law School of the University of Southampton. He gained his PhD from the University of Warwick and previously was a lecturer at the Universities of Reading and Manchester. He co-convenes the law and literature stream of the Socio-Legal Studies Association and is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Law and Humanities. David's paper is entitled Walls and Bridges, Metaphors of Movement and Constraint in Legal Responses to COVID-19. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Carl. Let me just share my screen. There, hopefully you can see that now. Well, as I say, thanks very much, Carl, for this opportunity to present in this forum. I'm really delighted to be here. Let me try and share with you some of the ideas that I've had for this project. So this research, it examines how the pandemic has been a spur to popular discourses on justice and fairness. You know, how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected what I call justice talk. And I do that by drawing on legal and policy sources primarily, but also efforts by people to share their experiences of the pandemic imaginatively. And I focus here chiefly on poetry, though of course it's not confined to that. So I say that this broad approach to understanding the pandemic and so-called justice talk is possible because we can see the legal and policy sources use language, as do poetic responses, imaginative responses. They both draw on this common store of what I call everyday metaphors. And by everyday metaphor, I mean all those schemes and concepts that we have, which are much more than just ornaments to language, but actually constitute the cultural world that we live in, that are inherently metaphorical, that are imaginative extensions of our physical and embodied experience. And of course, many of you, I'm sure, will recognize in that description of metaphors the Lakoff and Johnson approach to metaphors. So let me move on to the sort of contents page. These are the ideas that I'll be sort of talking about. Metaphors of movement in COVID discussions, the motion of the virus and the motion of people, queue jumping and corner cutting, and liberty, emotion, prohibited journeys. So let's start off with the first one. So metaphors of movement in COVID discussions. So when we talk about metaphorical language, of course, what we're talking about here is a ferrying or carrying over between the figurative and literal meanings. So between physical things on the one hand and abstract conceptual things on the other. So in the pandemic, we've seen a familiar metaphorical schema, which is that of movement, the title obviously of this workshop. So on a literal level, we're used now, I think, to talk about how fast the virus is spreading and where it's spreading to, the new rules and norms regarding bodily movements. So on the screen, you can see there's a picture from my university's refectory. I went in there to sort of check out the vibe in there, and as you can see, there wasn't much going on, but what there is all these stickers showing where our feet must be planted. So these new rules and norms regarding bodily movements is a very important part of the pandemic and how we experience it. At a more metaphorical level, of course, public discourse has often been dominated by talk of whether the government is going in the right direction, is it moving quickly enough in its responses, advances and setbacks in the responses. War metaphors are obviously very commonly used to describe responses to the pandemic, but of course, at a certain level, these are simply versions of the movement metaphor, because we are told we need to mobilize our forces. It's all about mobility. We're used to, of course, this is obviously from the UK government, but around the world, of course, governments hold their press conferences with their health advisors. This is the British Prime Minister, of course, Boris Johnson. We're used to them using language like we're on a cliff edge, we're on the brink, on the precipice. This idea of a buildup of kinetic energy that's ready to be expended. We're standing on a precipice, we're about to fall, who knows where, how far down. The crucial thing that I want to sort of spend a bit of time focusing on, though, is this distinction. At least in the UK, there's been this semantic distinction between a so-called full lockdown and a more palatable circuit breaker or fire break lockdown. So we can use the latter phrases, circuit breaker or fire break, to make sure we're focusing on stopping the virus rather than stopping human activity. So just focusing on that for a moment, here's our Prime Minister in the UK giving a speech. He's answering a question about why, this is back in September, did the virus seem to be circulating more freely in Britain than in other European countries, such as Italy or Germany. And if you read what he says there, he's talking about the virus, but actually he very quickly starts referring to people. So this is what he says. Actually, there is an important difference between our country and many other countries around the world. Do you think, where's he going with this speech? Our country is a freedom-loving country. If we look at the history of this country over the past 300 years, virtually every advance from free speech to democracy has come from this country. It's very difficult to ask the British population uniformly to obey guidelines in the way that is necessary. This is a very typical Boris Johnson piece of rhetoric. But what he's doing is slightly sly. He's taking a question about the virus and he's shifting it into talking about people. We have another example of this in Dr. P. Connolly, famously the physician of the President of the United States. And if you recall, Sean P. Connolly got into some hot water because when Donald Trump was first admitted to hospital, Sean P. Connolly gave a press conference to say everything was fine and the president wasn't receiving any sort of extreme medication, but then it turned out that he was. And this is how the doctor justifies that slightly, perhaps not quite true statement. He says, I didn't want to give any information that might steer the course of illness in another direction. And in doing so, it came off that we were trying to hide something which wasn't necessarily true. Now, he didn't want to steer the course of the illness in another direction. Now, of course, we can, I think, assume that the illness will just take its course. What he's actually saying here, of course, is that he didn't want to say anything that would provoke the sort of infamously unpredictable president from doing anything unwise or risky. He didn't want Donald Trump to think, okay, he can just jump out of bed and go to a rally. So what I'm trying to get at here is this peculiar interchangeability between movement of people and the movement of the virus. So one may be used as a metaphor for the other, depending on what you're trying to achieve with your rhetoric. We have sort of examples, of course, from people's imaginative responses to the to the pandemic. Here's an extract from Duncan Taylor's poem 2 Days in April, where he is trying to distinguish here the movement of people and the movement of the virus. Silence reigns, the virus roams. But of course, the two are interconnected, but the poem is trying to sort of disconnect the two. Another example, Grace Nichols' Harbour, does something quite clever, because she's trying to turn on its head the usual approach, which is seeking to bring the movement of the virus to a stop. She's saying, well, let's draw from the strength of the virus, which is its mobility, its ability to be airborne, and use that to sort of help keep the spirits of our National Health Service, the doctors, nurses, all our healthcare workers or our care workers going. So that's that. Moving on to a new topic, queue jumping and corner cutting. This is a slightly parochial example, perhaps, because it comes from the UK, but hopefully it points to broader themes as well. So in the spring of 2020, the Crown Prosecution Service, they report on a case of a man who was arrested for common assault after spitting and coughing theatrically at shop staff and police officers when they came to arrest him. But if you read the report of this case, the first thing you see in this huge headline is Poundland queue jumper. So the queue jumping seems to be the main point of this article, rather than the actual offences that he was committing. So the article goes on to distinguish very clearly between his transgressive mobility from the, and I put in italics in this quote, so it's my italics, people patiently waiting their turn in the queue. So the implication of the report, of course, is that the danger that this disorderly individual poses for the public is already demonstrated in his failure to restrain his movements. Never mind the fact that he goes on to commit things of actual crimes later on. And of course, there is a symbolism, a powerful symbolism in queue jumping. In the UK, we know this from, for example, the 1990s, where the Conservative government spoke about feckless young lone mothers who were trying to jump the queue and cut corners for social housing. And they made this a big policy play. So we can see here the sort of the metaphor of movement very powerfully being redeployed here in the pandemic. This idea that cutting corners is fundamentally unjust, and the government's role is to stamp that out. I just found a nice example of this theme, this topic that I'm trying to allude to here, this poem by Claire Booth, Social Distance Dancing. Obviously, there's no time to go through the poem as a whole, but you can see I've highlighted here the fact that although this is supposed to be a sort of jokey, sort of light-hearted take on how we behave in the shops, we try to avoid each other, we warily shop, wherever we go. In each of these verses, each of these stanzas, the point of the poem is that we do these things from a distance, carefully, mindfully, from afar, warily, prudently. This is a whole set of norms. This is alluding to the fact that everyone knows these rules, and so this man reported by the Crown Prosecution Service. Okay, he was spitting, he was coughing theatrically, but his real crime seems to be that he didn't understand how he was supposed to move in the pandemic. That's the real problem with him. And that brings me on to this fourth theme, liberty and motion, prohibited journeys. So I've talked about cutting corners in queues, queue jumping. But there's also stories that have come from this pandemic of people who have taken long journeys that have caused a stir in terms of, this is reprehensible and something we need to crack down on. So in the UK, there's these stories that have come out about political advisors, senior health advisors, and also members of parliament who have taken long journeys. The two most well-known examples here in the UK are Dominic Cummings, who famously or infamously took a journey from London to Durham with his family without telling the Prime Minister, and also the Scottish National Party legislator Ferrier, who travelled from Edinburgh to London and back again without telling her party leader what she was doing, and both got into hot water about this. So the picture is there, Dominic Cummings at his press conference, and where he's explaining that what he did was perfectly reasonable and within the rules. The thing about this is both these people engaged in behaviours in all sorts of ways that were reprehensible, or at least worthy of criticism. The failure to be candid with their party leader and health authorities, the failure to take any precautions to prevent their presence in public from endangering others, the failure to eventually resign. But it's the distance that they actually travelled that seemed to be most galling. The fact that it was so far between London and Durham, or Edinburgh and London, and that's what I think is most memorable. Now, the point is here is I'm not trying to deny that there's all sorts of extra political dimensions to this. People on this call who are in the UK will know that Dominic Cummings is a controversial figure for all sorts of reasons. He's the senior, he's resigned now, not because of this, but something subsequent. He was the Prime Minister's senior advisor. He was instrumental in the Brexit referendum in getting the Leave vote. So I'm not denying all of that. But what I'm saying is the travel aspect is so potent in terms of fairness and justice talk about these sorts of incidents because that's already a powerful means by which justice is conceptualized metaphorically. So there are other examples of high-ranking officials who've had to resign, but we don't really remember those. So, for example, Professor Neil Ferguson was the government's chief health advisor. He resigned in May 2020 after having been visited by his partner in his home during lockdown. Now, we don't remember that case. Of course, if you're outside the UK, you might think, well, why would we anyway? But I'm saying that there's a distinction between that case and, say, Dominic Cummings in the fact that we don't have this metaphorical framework for, in a vivid way, conceptualizing the wrong that was done. Neil Ferguson stayed in his house and was visited. It's a breach of the rules, so he had to resign, and he did resign. But it's more difficult to sort of hang a condemnatory argument on him. But it's easier in the case of Dominic Cummings because we have this long journey that was taken. Now, why am I making such a fuss about this? It's really because I think there's an important historical connection here in jurisprudence and legal philosophy between liberty as an abstract value and the physical embodied mobility of people's bodies. So here we've got Hobbes talking about freedom and liberty. I know freedom and liberty aren't necessarily the same thing, but this is the quote from him: liberty or freedom signifieth properly the absence of opposition. By opposition, I mean external impediments of motion. So he's saying there essentially that liberty and freedom are literally freedom from physical impediments. Blackstone as well, a century or so later, he says that personal liberty consists in the power of locomotion, of changing situation or removing one's person to whatsoever place one's own inclination may direct without imprisonment or restraint. So the physical idea of motion is very important when we're talking about these abstract concepts of liberty. And then sort of 200 years or so afterwards, George Lakoff, who gives us a sort of the modern perspective on metaphors, without, I think, having read either Hobbes or Blackstone, comes to almost exactly the same conclusion, but emphasizing the fact that it's a metaphor. It's not literally about motion. George Lakoff, he conceptualizes the idea of liberty in the same way. He says the concept of liberty or freedom has to do with the issue of constraints, which is conceptualized and reasoned about as if it were constraints on motion. He says this is where we get our idea of liberty and freedom because of our experience of freedom versus constraint in physical terms. So if liberty is indeed a conceptual metaphor that emanates from this physical experience of motion, then it's little wonder that when these cases arise, like the special advisor to the Prime Minister who made this long journey, it's little wonder that those sorts of stories produce vociferous denunciations, whereas other stories which don't involve those kinds of travel aspects are forgotten. We don't remember them. Just to sort of take us to the final bit of this, and just to sort of emphasize, I guess, how these sort of the poetic responses draw on the exact same metaphoric framework. Here's two examples here. So poems that critique sort of the early naive claims about equality and solidarity under lockdown typically allude to motion, the idea of moving through the crisis together. So Julie Sheldon's in the same boat. I think alludes to the fact that it's impossible to conceive of a stormy sea. She talks about the stormy sea as a metaphor, obviously, for the pandemic, except through its movement. We can't do it unless we have a metaphor of movement. And the one below, which is about who do we blame for the pandemic, emphasizes constraints on movement. The people who we blame are those people who aren't able to move. So I've highlighted there clumsy ones, queuing, bed blockers. And added to that list, you might put students return to university in September and October. I don't know if you recall, in the UK television pictures of Manchester University students breaking down this fence that the university had erected all around their halls of residence. So they obviously are expressing a view here that fairness and justice involves the possibility of movement. And they physically broke out of this fence and broke it down. And I think that also is a nice metaphor there for the way that movement is bound up with this idea of fairness, and how the pandemic shines a light on that. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end there. I've given a few examples, I think, of how the movement metaphor helps us conceive of justice during the pandemic. I'd be interested to know if others share that view. So thanks very much, Carl.
Thank you, David. A really fascinating paper that raises lots of interesting issues. I want to begin with a question from our audience. Question is, how far, and I think you've touched on this, but maybe you can elaborate a bit. How far are these metaphors an attempt to manage inherent contradictions between autonomy, independence, and the need to control or embed a sense of community? So between autonomy and community that we're seeing played out.
That's a very interesting question. Autonomy and community, I mean, these things are in tension, aren't they? And we do need a framework that can accommodate concepts that are in tension. I think as well as concepts in tension, though, it's experiences in tension. So we see protests against lockdown, for example. We see protests in favor of lockdown and against people who are against lockdown. So, I mean, if you look at this from a government's point of view, you need a way in which you can sort of accommodate all of these perspectives. I think in terms of the metaphor of movement, I think the fact that this is a sort of a dyad, isn't it? The metaphor is about movement on the one hand, but it's about constraint on the other. And I think, the question there is right, that this is an attempt to manage a tension. These are concepts that are antagonistic. I think what I'm trying to do is emphasize the fact that these tell us something about our understanding of justice as it's played out during the pandemic. But I would agree with the question there. Yeah, it is an attempt to manage concepts and tension.
I mean, I found your focus on movement compelling, and a number of there are ironies all over the place as well. And one thing that's struck me is the notion of travel and quarantine that emerges at a point in the pandemic. And I wonder if you could comment on that, because and actually, although this is justified on the basis of science, often it turns out to be very hard to defend in terms of actual infection rates in different countries. But there seems to be this need to, that international travel is somehow an illegitimate form of movement, not only in the UK, but worldwide.
Well, I think people are starting to come to this view. I mean, I know that as academics, we've often assumed that our international travel is absolutely essential to what we do, and the vociferous way in which we defend, for example, our, personal research budgets, just saying that we have them because it's so important to travel internationally. I think, the pandemic has given us a new perspective on that. I guess the final case study that I mentioned there about the Cummings and Ferry making these long trips, and the fact that it was that aspect that people found most galling, sort of this idea of an inequality, I guess, between people who felt that, well, I have to follow these rules, and others who found loopholes. I guess and that's another reason I think why I'm confident that the movement metaphor is a way of managing these sorts of perceptions. How necessary is it to travel? Internationally, are we actually doing an injustice by insisting on our, I guess, right to travel or our need to travel? I think these are discussions that we'll have to have with our institutions going forward.
At the same time, we know that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but the government has prioritized deportation flights, controversially, this month.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, that's actually an aspect that I haven't yet sort of worked into this paper, but I think that's absolutely right, because the deportations, these are sold as necessary. This is the just desserts of people who are on these flights. But I wonder how that fits into the overall picture of a fair and just response to the pandemic. When you compare that to in prisons, for example, people being locked in their cells 23 hours a day, but suddenly there's this capacity to move people across the world. There's something there that doesn't sit right, and I'm sure that we can sort of conceive that in terms of this metaphorical dyad.
Another question from our audience. To what extent do you analyze who's doing the action? For example, Cummings, special advisor to the PM, Ferguson, an individual independent scientific expert, and the power they have. It seems to be implied, I think, in the quote about the sea, that we're in different boats, and the risks involved in moving and motion if there are other people out there.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So it's true that someone like Cummings is in a different position because of his proximity to the government. He's one of the architects of the rules that he may be regarded as having broken. The poem there about the different boats, what I was sort of getting at there is the fact that at the start of the pandemic, there was quite a common metaphor, which is we are all in the same boat, to try to appeal to the sense of solidarity. And with repeated sort of unfortunate incidents like Cummings, where it became obvious that there were different ways of getting oneself out of the situation, or dealing with the situation in different ways that shows a power differential. We end up with another metaphor involving lots of boats, but in the same sea. And my point is that the fact that it's a sea, a moving object, that indicates that we're still talking about justice, possibly social justice. I think there is a difference between the different sorts of characters I'm talking about. The independent advisors, I guess, in a different position. I'd have to think about what the implications are for the argument as a whole. But I think that's something, that needs to be taken into account.
And it's interesting also that lately there have been a couple of articles in the media about the effectiveness of the use of metaphor by independent scientists versus politicians, with Professor Van Tam seeming to be more effective, that his metaphors resonate in a way that politicians' metaphors don't, which could be something else to connect this to.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, the Prime Minister is notorious for his war metaphors. I think perhaps it's just an over-familiarity there with politicians using metaphors. And if you listen, for example, to the morning radio, Radio 4, for example, we have here, politicians' language is full of metaphors, but they're often very clumsy metaphors, but I suppose Professor Van Tam has found a way to use this strategically. I guess, unlike many politicians, he understands that a carefully deployed metaphor can actually help, rather than simply obfuscate a case. So I think that's right. There's a big difference between the way that different people use metaphors and whether that's conscious or just because it's an unconscious part of their language.
And finally, I mean, I would suggest that there might be some interesting comparisons to be drawn around movement and viruses in some of the analysis historically around HIV. I'm thinking of work that was done around so-called patient zero, who was a flight attendant. And this idea that the movement of the individual is what spread almost in a quite personalized way, is what spread the virus exponentially. So I think you're definitely onto something with this idea of movement.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Okay. Well, I think we should move on. Thank you very much, David, for a fascinating paper. We'll move on to our final speaker today, Dr. Marco Wan. Marco is Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Law and Literary Studies program at the University of Hong Kong. His first book, Masculinity and the Trials of Modern Fiction, was awarded the Penny Pether Prize from the Law, Literature and Humanities Association of Australasia. His second book, Film and Constitutional Controversy, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Marco obtained his PhD and his law degree from the University of Cambridge, his LLM from Harvard Law School, and his BA from Yale. He is managing editor of the journal Law and Literature. Marco's paper is entitled Security and the Pandemic, A View from Hong Kong. And welcome, Marco. Over to you.
Thank you, Carl. So let me try to share my screen. There we go. So first of all, thank you very much, Carl, for organizing this wonderful, timely, and global series. I'm very excited to be taking part in it. So the starting point of my paper is an article that I came across about 6 months ago. And this was an article in Newsweek about a new national security law that Beijing introduced for Hong Kong in the midst of the pandemic. And according to the article, Beijing basically introduced this new national security law, which gobbles up Hong Kong's freedom at a time when the major Western democracies are distracted by COVID. And when I saw the cover image of this article, two things struck me. So the first thing that struck me about the cover image is the eating utensils that the Chinese president Xi Jinping is using. And I thought to myself, why is he using a knife and fork, right? To the extent that Beijing is gobbling up the freedoms in Hong Kong, it would presumably be doing it with a pair of chopsticks rather than a knife and fork. And so that made me wonder whether in this image there is an element of projection going on, right? In the sense of, what it's depicting may be less what's happening on the ground and more what's happening on the ground in the imagination of the international media. The second thing that struck me about the cover image is the title, right? So the end of Hong Kong. And the international media has been pronouncing the end of Hong Kong for as long as I can remember. Pretty much since I was in high school, probably before that. So a title like that makes me skeptical. And so I think there is a need to probe the international media's narrative about Hong Kong and China during the pandemic. And this is what I try to do in this paper. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I do think that developments that have happened in Hong Kong during the pandemic are worrying. Right, so to start with this controversial national security law. So to give you a sense of what this law contains, right? So the law contains, the offenses in the law are of very wide scope. So for instance, participation in subversive activities is criminalized. It's not entirely clear what participation means. The law has extraterritorial applications, so offenses committed outside of Hong Kong by a person who is not a permanent resident can be caught by the law. So potentially an offense committed by anyone, anywhere. The Beijing government can set up for itself an office safeguarding national security within Hong Kong. And under the law, some cases can be tried in mainland China, so outside of Hong Kong's common law system. The law specifically targets education. So the Hong Kong government has a duty to promote national security education in schools. I mean, it's not entirely clear what national security education means. And in the months leading up to the passage of the law, there were people who were very concerned because basically very, very few people in Hong Kong knew what the law was going to look like when it was drafted by Beijing. And at one point, the Secretary for Justice in Hong Kong was asked what she thought of the draft of this new national security law. And she said, I don't know, I haven't seen it. Further developments during the pandemic. So since this new law was passed, slogans associated with last year's anti-extradition protests, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So those slogans have now been banned. A number of veteran pro-democracy figures have been arrested. So these are figures who are now in their 70s. They're very well respected figures in the community. Current pro-democracy legislators have been arrested. And in the name of social distancing, elections for the legislature have been postponed. And the candlelight vigil commemorating the Tiananmen Square incident, so the June 4th incident, which takes place in Hong Kong every year, that has now been banned. So legal and political developments during the pandemic are worrying. But again, I think the conventional narrative in the Western media is not quite right. And what I mean by that is that I think these developments need to be understood in the context of a much longer and much more complex story about cultural identity in Hong Kong. And this paper is my attempt to tell the story and to situate recent developments within it. So to take a step back and to start at the beginning, right? So Hong Kong was a British colony. It was announced in 1984 that Britain would hand back sovereignty over the city to China, and China resumed sovereignty in 1997. And at the time, there were a lot of fears in Hong Kong that the freedoms and rights that people had in the city would disappear after the handover. And to address those fears, the paramount leader in China at the time, Deng Xiaoping, came up with this idea of one country, two systems. And that's enshrined in our constitutional document, the Basic Law. Right, so basically what that means is that Hong Kong is an inalienable part of China, but it operates under a different system. So a different economic system primarily, but also a different legal system based on the common law, and also a different political system. Now, what I think often gets elided in doctrinal discussions of Hong Kong constitutional law is the imbrication of law and cultural identity. And one of the few people who have looked at this imbrication is the socio-legal scholar Carol Jones. So in her book, Lost in China, Law, Culture, and Identity in Post-1997 Hong Kong, she argues that Hong Kong identity is premised on the idea of having rights and freedoms which people in mainland China do not have, like the freedom of expression, like the freedom of assembly, the ability to criticize the government openly, the ability to protest. And this conception of identity, this conception of Hong Kong identity being premised on having rights and freedoms that people across the border don't have, this was a conception that was actively promoted by the colonial administration. So for many years, the colonial administration, in order to foster a sense of loyalty amongst the people in Hong Kong to the city, promoted this idea that people in Hong Kong were different, were distinct, because there were these rights and freedoms that people across the border didn't have. And this was ironic, given that for a long time, the colonial administration's record of protecting local rights and freedoms was patchy at best. But nonetheless, one country, two systems became regarded as a guarantee of rights and freedoms, and cultural identity in Hong Kong became intertwined with one country, two systems. And importantly, Jones argues that the basic law became regarded as part of the walls of law that were erected to protect Hong Kong identity. So she says that documents like the Basic Law and the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Bill of Rights here were part of these kind of legal ramparts that were erected to set Hong Kong apart. Another figure who's talked about Hong Kong identity in a similar vein is Akbar Abbas, the cultural critic. And Abbas makes the point that for a long time, very few people in Hong Kong thought of themselves as quote unquote Hong Kongers, and that paradoxically, the idea of a distinct Hong Kong identity only emerged in relation to the fear that this very identity could disappear after the handover. So this is an identity that's intertwined with the possibility, the prospect of its own disappearance. And he calls this the politics of disappearance. For my purposes, I'm going to talk about one specific provision, which is Article 23 in the Basic Law, and one specific event, which is the Article 23 controversy back in 2002 to 2003. And I want to focus on this for a bit because I think this is a pivotal moment in the formation of post-colonial Hong Kong identity. So Article 23 of the Basic Law is a provision on national security, and it stipulates that the Hong Kong government has a constitutional obligation to enact national security law after the handover. And so the introduction of a national security law in and of itself isn't that controversial in the sense that it's already provided for in the constitutional document. And the government tried to do that back in 2002. But what happened was, it severely underestimated the concerns people had about the impact of this law on local rights and freedoms. And so people were terrified that if you introduce a national security law, you would import into Hong Kong ideas about national security and legal norms in the mainland, and people were very worried. But the government was determined to push through this law. It was dismissive of dissenting voices. In the words of one journalist at the time, they tried to push through the national security law with the grace of a battle tank at full throttle with guns blazing. And what happened was 500,000 people took to the streets in protest in 2003 because of this attempt to introduce the law. And for people who know Hong Kong, this happened in the summer, and the summer in Hong Kong is very unpleasant, right? It's very hot, it's very humid. So the fact that so many people came out in protest at the time, despite all that, really shows how worried people were. The protests drew people from different domains of Hong Kong society. So there were lawyers who were worried about human rights safeguards. There were students who were worried about their future. There were filmmakers and artists who were worried about freedom of expression, artistic freedom, doctors, bankers, the elderly. And I think from a cultural studies perspective, what happened was that the government severely underestimated the operation of the politics of disappearance, right? It underestimated the extent to which the threat to rights and freedoms that people perceived was also regarded as a threat to Hong Kong identity, right? So even though the introduction of laws relating to national security is explicitly provided for in the constitutional document, it became regarded as a breach in the walls of law. To quote a former colleague of mine, Carol Peterson, the introduction of the law is meant as a kind of revolving door between Hong Kong and mainland China, right? There's a provision in there that specifically is meant to be a connection point. But this revolving door became regarded as a breach in the walls of law, and at stake was nothing less than the possibility of Hong Kong identity. The outcome of that event was that the government backed down, and the law was shelved indefinitely, right? So the Hong Kong government did not introduce national security law back in 2003. And again, from a cultural studies perspective, one point to note about this protest was that the idea of protest from that moment on became inextricably tied with Hong Kong identity. Right? In other words, the Article 23 controversy deepened the idea that being a Hong Konger meant having freedoms like the right to protest, not found anywhere else in China. Right? So a scene like that in the slide, I mean, with that many people protesting on the street, that would not be possible anywhere else in China. And as some scholars have argued, that moment in 2003 led to the development of a protest culture in Hong Kong. And I think the Hong Kong experience suggests that there is an element of precarity inherent in a cultural identity intertwined with the idea of protest. So to give you a sense of what's happened since 2003, so there have been kind of an increasing number of protests in Hong Kong. To give you some of the most significant ones, so back in 2012, there was a protest against the introduction of national education. So the Hong Kong government tried to implement national education in local high schools. And it said that this was a form of normal civic education. There was nothing sinister about it. But it sparked outcries of attempts to brainwash Hong Kong students. And there were protests started by parents and students. This was all initiated by a student activist called Joshua Wong, who's now kind of the face of protest for Hong Kong. And at the time, he was still a high school student. And what happened at the end of that protest was that the Hong Kong government again backed down. But the protest made education a key target area in the eyes of Beijing, where it started thinking that something was amiss with education in Hong Kong. 2014 was the year of Occupy Central, the movement that's more commonly known as the Umbrella Movement. This was a civil disobedience movement which attempted to pressure the Hong Kong government into democratizing Hong Kong. And so the protesters demanded genuine universal suffrage, and this lasted 79 days. And I think there is a real sense of disillusionment associated with this movement. So this movement kind of fizzled out towards the end. That image that you see in the slide, I mean, that's taken from, I think, quite an early part of the movement. So towards the end, there weren't half as many people there on the streets. The demands were largely unmet, and the leaders were all subsequently arrested. And then last year, there were even bigger protests against a proposed law that would have allowed fugitives from China to be into Hong Kong to be extradited for trial in mainland China. Right. So again, the government argued that there was nothing sinister about this law. If there's a fugitive that's from China that has arrived in Hong Kong, right, that person should be sent back to China for trial. But under the arrangements in Hong Kong, because of one country, two systems, that wasn't possible. But this proposed law sparked fears that non-fugitives in Hong Kong could also be sent to the mainland for trial. So the fear was that once you set up that kind of passageway between the two systems, then potentially at some point, people in Hong Kong committing crimes in Hong Kong could also be sent to the mainland for trial. And that terrified people. And it became, again, regarded as a significant breach in the walls of law. And so in response to this proposed law, 1 million people marched peacefully, but this time the government refused to concede. And when it refused to concede, 2 million people marched, and the government still refused to concede. And I think at that point, people were so terrified, desperation sunk in, and protesters turned to violence as a way to try to stop this law from being passed. So to give you a sense of what happened in Hong Kong last year, so the protesters destroyed the Legislative Council building. They entered it, vandalized it. LegCo was brought to a halt for many months. They torched subway stations. They vandalized mainland Chinese banks. So it was no longer safe for bank employees to go and work there, or for people to use the services there. And they laid siege to university campuses. So some university campuses became this kind of battleground between the protesters and the law enforcement forces. And I think one way of thinking about these images is as kind of a reflection of the politics of disappearance, a kind of deep fear, not only of a breach in the walls of law, but of the erasure of Hong Kong identity, which is premised on the idea of a separate legal system. And the government's refusal to back down led to desperation. So these protests, these violence, this kind of vandalism are kind of cri de coeur, right? Kind of raging against what many felt was a disappearing identity. And the irony is that the prolonged unrest and violence of the 2019 protests led directly to China's heavy-handed response during the pandemic to the national security law and to a significant restriction of the space for dissent. So what conclusions can we draw from what's happened in Hong Kong over the past kind of decade and a half, and also from what's happened more recently during the pandemic? I think one conclusion is that the conventional narrative in the international media of China as this kind of predatory sovereign, in this instance, is ahistoric and decontextualized. I think it's not quite right to see Beijing as, again, using the pandemic as an excuse to gobble up Hong Kong's freedom while Western democracies are preoccupied with COVID. I think, if you think about what was happening on the ground, right, in 2019, the Hong Kong government basically had seemed to lost control of the situation. Right? It was the violence was spiraling, was getting out of control. And Beijing felt like it had to do something to address an issue which had been left hanging since at least 2003. And that's, of course, coupled with Beijing's concerns with, some might say obsession with, foreign interference, right? This idea that America is behind the protests and is using Hong Kong as a way to destabilize China. It's a heavy-handed response, and I think it does little to address worries about the politics of disappearance. But I do think that no one, including Beijing, wanted the clampdown to happen. Right? It was just the way kind of historical trajectory ran its course. The second conclusion, I think, is that this is ultimately a tale of misperceptions and misreadings. Right? A misperception on the part of many people in Hong Kong, on the part perhaps of the international media, of China, as this kind of big menacing other, right? A misperception on the part of China of Hong Kongers as all being unruly rioters, of America as the mastermind of the protests, of Britain as the colonial master that refuses to accept Chinese sovereignty. Right? So every time Dominic Raab says something about Hong Kong, Beijing's response is, "Oh, you're interfering with Chinese sovereignty." And I think, for me, this is a story not only about law, even though it's about national security law and its introduction during the pandemic, but it's also a story about a cultural identity and the possibility of its continuation. And I'll stop there.
Great. Fascinating paper, Marco. Really rich and brings together a number of themes relevant to the series. I wanted to ask you, first of all, if you had any thoughts, and this sort of connects to David's paper, the idea of walls and movement, and of course also the way in which the virus has been constructed in the West, particularly by the President of the United States, explicitly as the Chinese virus, as this kind of a kind of creation of Beijing almost. And does that connect to the themes going on in Hong Kong, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question. I was actually thinking about this as I was listening to David's paper. And I think this comes back to David's point about movement, mobility, and also the ways in which metaphors structure our thinking, right? So, to come back to that shift from this metaphor of a connecting door to a metaphor of a breach in the wall of law. I mean, that really changes the way you look at things. And construe a situation in reality, and I think, I think in order to think more productively about, how a pandemic, how governance should be managed during a pandemic, how these tensions I've been pointing to can be managed, generally and also during a pandemic. We need to think about how to change those metaphors. And to think about, the kinds of impasses that the metaphors lead us to. So again, something like a wall, if you think of the situation as a breach in a wall that protects you, right? Then you're much less likely to try to find a space for, mutual understanding and dialogue and communication.
Okay. Question from our audience. How would you see the course of Hong Kong's cultural identity and the perceived notion of a politics of disappearance in the next 10 years? Hard question, but asking you to look forward.
How do I think of it in the next 10 years? What's going to happen to it? Let me think about that. I mean, I think I've got, a two-part answer. I think the first part is that the politics of disappearance, as I understand it, is not so much related to an actual disappearance. So in the sense, it is a metaphor, but it's also a kind of affect. Right, it's a sense of disappearance rather than any kind of actual erosion. So in that sense, I think it's going to continue. Right, this has been a defining element of Hong Kong identity for as long as I can remember, and I don't see it changing in the next 10 years. So that affect of disappearance, that affective politics of disappearance, I think is still going to be there. In terms of and again, I'm thinking now in terms of some of the themes that David brought up. In terms of this metaphor of moving forward in the next 10 years, I think one thing that would be productive is to, instead of moving forward, is to move backwards, right? And think back over the past, however long it is since the handover, since 97, and think about how we got to where we are, right? So the introduction of this national security law, again, I think is something that nobody wanted. And at one point, it was the only way really to break the impasse. So thinking about a productive way of thinking about law identity in the next 10 years is to think back over the past 20 years and think, how did we get to where we are, and use that as a way of understanding where we might be going.
Okay. While I ask my next question, could you maybe exit your screen share now?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
There you go.
So I can see you properly. You make a really interesting point about kind of national cultural identity in Hong Kong, and the way in which highlights an old theme about the way in which national identities are invented, this idea of protest as being central to identity. But as you suggest, it's an invention of a relatively recent history. I mean, is this something that's really taken hold, or is this are people? Is there a skepticism about this as being somehow an essential part of what it means to be a Hong Konger?
Is there some skepticism? I mean, notions of cultural identity are, there's never any full consensus about it, I would imagine, right? So I'm not suggesting that, every single Hong Konger thinks that way. But I do think that there is at least a critical mass of people who think about identity in those terms. But, would there be challenges to it? Would there be some skepticism towards it? Sure. Yeah. And I think that is part of the construction, right? So the fact that protest is there as part of the conversation about Hong Kong identity, even if the conversation is, is protest really part of Hong Kong identity, is already showing how ingrained it is in the conception of identity, right? So the fact that this debate exists and some people are saying, oh, well, maybe this element isn't part of it. It's precisely what shows that this element is part of it, right? In the kind of broader construction of things.
And finally, you make a really interesting point about if the right to protest is constructed as kind of central to identity, that's you described it as precarious, a precarious basis for identity. And I wonder if you can expand on that, because it seems to me that this is something we're seeing not just in Hong Kong, but in a lot of places where identity seems to be founded on protest, whether it be in the UK around Brexit, whether it be in the US around Trump supporters. Where's the precariousness as you see it?
Right. So, I mean, as you intimate, right? I mean, this linkage between protest and identity is not specific to Hong Kong, right? So that's not what I'm arguing. What I've tried to do in this paper is to show how that manifests itself within the Hong Kong context, right? So how identity and protest are interlinked within this specific cultural and jurisdictional context. The precarity, I think, again, what I'm referring to is the precarity of that linkage between protest and identity in the specific circumstances here, right? So the Hong Kong experience suggests that there is a certain precarity, but that may not be the case elsewhere. I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on the specific geographical context that we're talking about. So in Hong Kong, the precarity comes from the fact that we're located within China, right? And people have started talking about the semi-authoritarianism within Hong Kong, right? So if your identity is linked to protest and you're located within a semi-authoritarian regime, that makes the notion of identity precarious, right? Because there's only so much protest that can happen within that regime. Now, is it precarious in other places? Again, it depends on where it is. I mean, in the US, ideas about protest, is that precarious? Possibly. I mean, it does look, I mean, up until recently with the election outcome, it was looking pretty unstable. So, how might that have developed if the election hadn't turned out the way it did? I'm not sure. And then, that's not a euphemism. I genuinely do not know.
Great. Well, I think we will stop there. Our time is up. But thank you, Marco, for a fantastic paper in the series. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. and presenting such incredibly rich and deeply textured papers. Thank you as well to our audience for joining us and for your participation. Our next workshop in the series will be on the 21st of January at 1500 GMT, and I hope you will join me then. Until then, it's goodbye from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. Goodbye, everyone.